Okay, I'm going to mute for about 30 seconds so I can run.
Sounds good. No problem. Okay, so folks are filing in, but I'll just go ahead and start making some announcements. Greetings, everyone. My name is Rachel Hasna, and I am with UNM's Division for Community Behavioral Health. Thanks for joining our Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. A couple of quick announcements regarding our CEU process. In the last 5 minutes of the lecture, we will be submitting a link in the chat. If you toggle your mouse to the bottom of your screen, you'll see a chat icon. You just click on that. That'll bring up the chat box and you'll see the link in there. Click the link, fill out the evaluation, and a certificate of completion is automatically generated for you. It's your responsibility to save a copy. So if you're joining us from your smartphone, you want to just take a screenshot of the document. If you're on your computer, you can save it as a Word doc or a PDF. If you scroll to the bottom right of the screen, you'll there's an option there to email yourself a copy. So you can do that as well. We will be emailing out the recording link as well as the slides for folks later on in the week. And then I just wanted to make sure to mention, because we have been getting a lot of requests around whether our series would offer CMEs, so the medical continuing education credits, and we have finally been approved for that. So more than likely it'll be next week. We still have to get some documentation to that department, but more than likely next week or the following week, we'll be able to provide CMEs for the didactic series as well. Okay, and I'll hand it over to Julie. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Rachel. And we are working on CLEs for you attorneys out there. It's posed a bit of a bigger problem. It's a little bit been hard to get those approved, but we will see what we can do, and we are working on it. It is on our radar. So welcome everyone to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health Didactic Series. This series is hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences and the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so glad to have you all here to join us today. My name is Julie Brovko. I'm an assistant clinical professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. First, I want to remind you to join us next week. At that time, Dr. Kimberly Brown is presenting insanity defense typology. Next, for our talk today, please ask your questions in the Q&A anytime you feel comfortable, but just know we're probably not going to get to them until the end. As always, we try to get to as many of your questions as possible, but just I want to say, please forgive us now if we can't get to yours. For those of you that want CEUs but are on a tight schedule, you do have to stay for the full hour, but you don't have to stay longer than that. So I'll try and let you know when that hour has passed, but we will likely be staying on longer to address questions. So now it's time for what we've all been waiting for. I'd like to introduce to you our speaker for today, Dr. Barry Rosenfeld. Dr. Rosenfeld is a professor of psychology and adjunct professor of law at Fordham University. He is past president of the International Association of Forensic Mental Health Services, and member of the editorial board of several prominent psychology journals. He has published widely on a wide range of topics, including malingering, competence to stand trial, violence risk assessment, and cross-cultural issues in forensic assessment. He conducts evaluations in both civil and criminal forensic settings, and has specialized in the evaluation of individuals in diverse cultural settings, both within and outside the US. So Dr. Rosenfeld, we're so grateful to have you here today and for your time and expertise. On behalf of the University of New Mexico, I'd like to welcome and thank you for presenting today. I'm now going to turn it over to you.
Thanks, Julie. I appreciate the invitation. I'm flattered to be here. I guess I'm supposed to say I have no financial relationship to this program, which is free. So there you go. Let me see if I can figure out how to advance my own slides. And there's my disclaimer. So these are my views, not the University of New Mexico's. I'm just going to cover a couple of things today. We only have an hour-ish. So this is going to be essentially a snippet of what I present in a much longer workshop. I'm actually midway through a workshop on cultural issues in forensic assessment broadly, some of which is about malingering, or feigning, we're going to call it for today. But I want to talk today just a little bit broadly about how culture can impact feigning assessments in general, talk a little bit about tests that have stronger and to some extent weaker support in the cross-cultural literature, and then close with a little bit of discussion of how to think about these test results, how to incorporate testing into an evaluation of somebody from what I'll call, for the sake of brevity, a diverse cultural background, because of course that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So, and again, I'm happy to take questions at the end. Hopefully there'll be some. I want to start with APA and the ethics code. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. Some of you may perhaps not if you're not psychologists, but this is the statement that our ethics code makes about assessment with regard to cultural diversity, that psychologists use assessment instruments whose validity and reliability have been established for use with members of the population tested. So what this means is that there's got to be some kind of an examination of whether the test that I would like to use is useful with the person who I want to use it with. And so that puts a lot of emphasis on the practitioner in terms of thinking about which tests to use. Some people default by saying, you know what, I'm not going to do anything. I don't want to open up a can of worms or a Pandora's box by using tests that might expose me to having done something questionable. But I'm going to try to convince you, and I don't know why I said convince, I'm going to try to make an argument that testing can be done. It's often feasible, it's often appropriate, but it's almost always going to require us to interpret test results with some caution and judiciously, if you will. So that's kind of where I'll go today. I want to back up now and just talk a little bit about the broader context for this, because cultural competence has been the kind of the buzzword that has increasingly been used in our field, in most fields, frankly. And we don't really have a lot of simple definitions of what it means to be culturally competent. And I should probably start by saying this presentation will not make you culturally competent. Nothing makes anyone culturally competent, because that phrase, culturally competent, implies that it's an achievement that one can achieve, that you can reach some threshold by which you have achieved competence. And it's not a goal, it's not an aspiration, it's a constant movement, it's a constant goal, it's a constant struggle to become increasingly aware of cultural influences. And to do that, I think it's really key to start by understanding who you are. I've taken to likening this process to, in a sense, it kind of mimics what the psychoanalysts used to do, or still do, I think, for the handful that are still out there, when they would require an analyst to first go into their own psychoanalysis for a few years to get a better understanding of themselves before they would treat other people. If we want to think about people from another culture, we've got to start by thinking about ourselves. What are our assumptions? What are our expectations? How are they shaped by our own cultural background? And that's going to give us a greater ability to see the differences in other people. And when we start to look carefully at this, we can start to see that culture is embedded in virtually everything we do in psychology. It's almost impossible to think about psychology independent of culture. Most of our tests were developed in generally the European American context. Most of them were developed in the US, but they all come from a particular vantage point, even if that's got some breadth to it. And that starts to become increasingly questionable as we broaden our range of who we treat and who we evaluate. And of course, as everybody on this Zoom no doubt knows, pretty much everyone we evaluate in a forensic setting is going to be very, very different from us. Even if that difference isn't skin color, racial background, it's going to be things like socioeconomic status, educational background, And of course, culture can have very, very broad definitions. So why does this matter in forensic assessment? I mean, obviously at the broadest level, I think we need to understand other people in order to not only be increasingly tolerant of differences, empathetic towards people's perspectives, but most importantly, to try to minimize the potential for bias, for our test results and our clinical impressions to lead us to conclusions that may not be justified, that may not be appropriate or objective, if you will. And of course, the goal is to be as accurate as we can and to achieve as fair an outcome as we can, or to help the legal system achieve as fair an outcome as we can. What does that mean? That means we really have to change how we think about our practice. We really have to think in a broad way. And I'm going to focus on a particular type of cultural diversity in this presentation, more international, linguistic, kind of broad strokes. We could just as easily have this presentation talking about cultural issues between Black, Indigenous, non-Hispanic white, and Latinx individuals within any given country, most importantly within the United States. We've got differences just within ourselves. I'm going to speak to things that are a little bit broader than that for the most part, but I'll talk a little bit about those more narrow differences, more within culture differences, if you will. But all of that's going to hinge on us trying to understand what someone else has done, why they did it, why they behaved the way they did, and separating that from what are essentially a priori expectations of them might have been. So let's focus in a little bit on testing, because this is about feigning, and what do we do when we administer tests to detect feigning, since that is in fact probably the standard approach to detection of feigning. Yes, I know there are lots of techniques for asking general questions, for trying to fish for suspicious symptoms. But by and large, I think if we really suspect that feigning is taking place, I think we're on thin ice not to use testing. And the interpretation of tests that we give is always going to be influenced by cultural norms. How a person reads an item on the MMPI is influenced by their cultural norms. Beliefs, behaviors that they have, that the person might have, they might be perfectly normative in one context, in one culture, but seem completely bizarre in another. A lot of the test-taking behaviors, and I'll come back and talk about this a little bit more later, but familiarity with the way we take tests, the way we administer tests, also varies dramatically across cultures. In Western cultures, we're pretty familiar with the simple rating scales, even true-false questions, or degree of agreement. Strongly agree, somewhat agree, neutral, slightly disagree, whatever that rating scale, that Likert type rating scale. Many people in many cultures don't really understand what that means. Even the concept of true-false is sometimes challenging, because if you really get down to it, what questions are absolutely true, absolutely false? It's almost always a matter of degree. So how familiar someone is with that testing style is going to vary dramatically. And again, I'll try to cover some of that, but we're going to rush through things fairly quickly because we've only got about 45 minutes or so. So I thought I'd start with the sort of broadest strokes. And this is a review paper that a student, now former student of mine, Alicia Neidham-Jones, and I published now 4 years ago. It's a little bit dated. Probably it's time for somebody to do an update on it. But we reviewed all of the cross-cultural research we could find specifically on feigning tools. This was published in the Psychological Assessment. And I think I have the references in the last slide. We found 45 studies from 13 countries. The majority of them, almost 3/4 of them, were from 3 countries. Not surprisingly, a chunk of them were from the US. So these are studies conducted within the US, but with people who typically spoke another language. Usually that was Spanish. There's a fair amount of research on feigning from Germany and Spain. A lot of the European countries have done some of this research, but Actually, if you look at that study, you'll see some very idiosyncratic countries represented that you might not expect. Turkey, Iraq, was it Iraq or Iran? It was Iran, sorry. A study here, a study there. And that'll have some importance as we kind of move along and start to think about cross-cultural validity of testing, because you might find, as you will, that there are very large countries that have virtually no research to support the applicability of feigning tools in that country. Or maybe there's 1 or 2 studies for a country of, let's say, 1 billion or more people, like China or India. Very small research base out there. And one of the things that was noteworthy in that review, and I'll talk about this review in various points this afternoon, one of the things that was noteworthy about that review is that the vast majority of studies used a fairly simplistic simulation design. So for those of you who aren't intimately familiar with designs and what they do, a simulation design is when we basically take a group of healthy, non-mentally ill individuals, typically with non-mentally ill individuals, and we ask some of them to pretend to have a mental disorder, and they're the feigners. And then we compare them to people who either have no mental illness and we said, answer this honestly, or if we're doing a slightly better job, we'll have a control group where they have a mental disorder and we've asked them to respond honestly. But as you might imagine, the college student or the person from the community who we've paid $25 to pretend to be mentally ill, well, that's quite different from the feigners that we might be used to seeing in a criminal justice setting or in any other forensic setting where there's a very strong incentive to feign well, to not be detected. If you're in civil litigation, you might have millions of dollars at stake. In fact, you will often have, in this country, millions of dollars at stake if you do a good job feigning. If you're in a criminal justice setting, it might literally be a life or death difference. You might, if you're successful, not be eligible for the death penalty, as opposed to having the death penalty, or if not that, maybe life without the possibility of parole. So these can be very important motivators, all of which are absent in a simulation design. And as a result, there's lots and lots of evidence that these simulation designs make research studies, make feigning tools look better than they probably are. I'm not going to get too in depth about that, but I'll bring that up in a couple of places. And so I wanted to just put that out there by way of backdrop, as a kind of keep that in the back of your mind. We've always got to think about the nature of the research when we're interpreting the research that's out there. So I'm going to break this up in terms of the presentation to talk about the 2 kind of broad categories of feigning. So and those 2 broad categories are psychiatric symptoms and cognitive symptoms. So cognitive effort tests or psychiatric symptom tests. Those are the 2 biggest distinctions. Sorry, I always forget to unplug my phone. There are, of course, other types of feigning. We may encounter people who are feigning purely medical symptoms. It's sort of the classic person walking into a courtroom with a neck brace from a car accident, and then they get out and suddenly don't need the neck brace or the crutches anymore. That is certainly another area of feigning, but where most of the research and most of our tools in mental health focus is on psychiatric symptoms like psychosis, like depression, like post-traumatic stress disorder, and the cognitive symptoms, intellectual functioning, brain damage, other sorts of neurological impairment, things of that nature. Generally speaking, when we use some kind of an inventory that's going to detect psychiatric symptom exaggeration, and I probably should have said this at the outset too, so excuse me for now backing up. I'm using the term feigning, and I'm going to try to keep using that term instead of malingering. For those of you who don't make much out of that distinction, there is an important conceptual distinction, but really we're talking about more or less the same thing. The conceptual distinction is that malingering is feigning for a reason. So in some sense, the testing that we do, the studies with a simulation design, that's really feigning. They're faking. They're not malingering because they don't have this sort of external incentive like the money, like the get out of jail or reduced sentence dangling in front of them, carrot that they can be chasing after. So we typically use the term feigning to talk about the research with the notion that it has implications for our understanding of malingering. But thinking about psychiatric symptoms for a minute, when we want to interpret any test of psychiatric symptom validity, we're going to basically be looking at how a given individual's pattern of responses deviate from what we call normative data, the typical response pattern. So for those of you who are familiar with the MMPI, we have a scale on the MMPI called the F scale, or the FP scale is another one. And there's a certain level of elevation that's normative. There's a certain level that's higher than that, that's normative for people with a serious mental illness. And then there's a threshold above which we are very, very suspicious. Well, those thresholds depend on the normative data. And how accurate our interpretations are depend on how good our normative data are. And again, that's something that I'll come back to and talk about a little bit later, but pretty soon, because I'll start talking about the MMPI in particular fairly soon. The other concept I want to throw at you, and I apologize if I'm throwing too many concepts too quickly and probably speaking too quickly. Welcome to New York. For those of you who don't know, I'm from New York. I live in New York City. We just talk fast here. We got a lot of other things to do. You all have my undivided attention, but I have too many slides and too much information on them. So the concept that I'm referring to is ETIC versus EMIC. So ETIC research, and we talk about cross-cultural research, the two approaches are ETIC and EMIC. And ETIC basically says we're going to take our tool, we're going to translate it, we're going to apply it to a novel population, and then we're going to look and see if there are any differences. The EMIC approach is much more grassroots. It basically says, hey, well, let's explore this concept. So rather than take a depression scale and translate it into Spanish and administer it to a group of people from El Salvador, we could go interview, that would be the ETIC approach. We could go interview a bunch of people from El Salvador and talk to them and find out how they feel, what happens to them when they've had a loss, when they've had sadness, when something's going on. And we might find that there are different symptoms that apply. So EMIC tells us something very different than ETIC. And ETIC is really asking the question, how well does this test work that we've established in another population? That's okay, it's a starting point, but it's never going to be the ending point. The best example of that is the MMPI. The MMPI has been translated into a number of different languages. I have lost count, well over 20. I didn't put the website here, but if you're interested and you Google MMPI translation, you'll come upon the University of Minnesota's website that's devoted to translated versions of the MMPI. And what you'll see is that for each language, you click on the language, and it'll tell you if there's an MMPI-2 translation, an MMPI-RF translation, an MMPI-A translation, which I didn't list here because mostly I'm talking about adults. And you'll see lots and lots of different languages, some of which there's multiple versions of. There's a version of French for France. There's a version of French for Quebec. There's not a version of French for Haiti, which may be a meaningful difference. There are 3 Spanish versions. They all have a little bit of overlap, but the simplest distinction is one of them is really for Spain and Argentina. Another is for Central America. There's one that's more Caribbean focused, but it's not a clean distinction, and it's not always clear how different they are. Most languages have one version, and it's available in 1, 2, maybe 3 of those tests, the 2, the RF, or the A. But what does that mean? That means if I need to evaluate somebody who is Greek, and I did a couple of years ago. I had to go to Athens to do some evaluations, and I thought I should use an MMPI, and I was able to email the publisher that publishes the Greek MMPI. Lovely man, I'm blocking on his name because that's what happens to your memory at my age. But he was all too happy to sell me the Greek MMPI for a reasonable price. He wanted to hand deliver them to me at a lovely rooftop bar where we met and had a drink. I was able to scan them and email them, the test results back to him. And then he emailed me the results in English, but also with the original Greek. Couldn't have been easier. And of course, you know, and now I have a couple of assumptions to make. I have to assume that this is translated correctly. I have no way of knowing that. Seemed like a very professional operation, so I'd like to give them the benefit of the doubt. I have to assume that the normative data is reasonable. There was a publication with a decent sized sample and showed some fairly small but noticeable distinctions between the Greek norms and the US norms. But all of that could be done relatively easily. A couple of years later, about a year ago, I needed a Bulgarian MMPI. Couldn't get it. They wouldn't sell it to me. Had numerous back and forths. I'm a licensed psychologist. I'm evaluating somebody who only speaks Bulgarian. Can you please sell me a copy of the Bulgarian MMPI? Couldn't get it, no matter how long I tried. So you know, the availability of these translations is a little more complicated than clicking on the link and following it on the MMPI website. But I would say more often than not, I've been able to get them when I needed them, provided I had 3 weeks or so of lead time. Now, what none of this speaks to is the normative data. And I think I might have a slide on that a little bit later, but some of these countries and translations, in my experience, have their own normative data. Some don't. The Hebrew translation of the MMPI, they didn't send me any scoring templates or plotting templates. And when I said, you know, what do I do with it? They said, oh, we just plotted on the US norms. I think Israel is quite different than America. So plotting them on the US norms may or may not be appropriate, but there's no data to do otherwise. So things that we need to keep in mind when we're interpreting this test data. Availability and validity are two different things. For those of you who are keeping up to date, we do now, of course, have an MMPI 3. That's only available in Spanish so far. I'm sure it will be translated into lots of other languages. I suspect Yossi Ben-Poreth is already working on the Hebrew translation himself, but he does have very good Spanish language norms, or what he describes as very good Spanish language norms. I haven't looked carefully at them, but it's a bigger sample than we ever had in the US. So, you know, thinking about testing and thinking about the data by which we interpret it are two related but important questions. And I guess I did have a slide on this. The quality of the normative data is going to be highly variable. Some of these test manuals that come with a translated version of the MMPI have fairly small samples, have very little, if any, validity around the interpretation of some of those elevations that we might see. And what does that mean? I mean, again, essentially, we're looking at an elevation on a scale, and we'd like to interpret that an elevation on, let's say, the F scale, which is one of our validity scales. At a certain point, we'd like to say that probably means the person's feigning. But that determination is going to depend on the normative data that we're comparing it to. And there's been very little research that looks at the interpretations that we would want to make and whether that's impacted by culture, by language. There's been a little bit. And this is an example of that point. So this is an actual MMPI from an actual person who took the MMPI, but he was a Chinese immigrant, had been in the US for only a few years. And originally I plotted this on the US norms. He understood English well enough. He took it basically in English, but occasionally wanted to have a translation for a couple of items. But I plotted it using the Chinese norms and the US norms. And you can see that the F and the FP and the FB, they're very elevated. If you plot them on the US norms, they're not as elevated on the Chinese norms. So what would have looked like a very clear case of feigning on US norms becomes a little bit more equivocal. I'm not looking at these data and saying this couldn't be feigning. In fact, given his clinical presentation, I think he was feigning. It just wasn't nearly as extreme. And sometimes this is a practice that I'll engage in when I've got somebody from a different culture. If they've been in the US for a while and there's this question of how acculturated they are, which set of norms is appropriate. And you know, this can be a very challenging question. I did an evaluation years ago of an Italian man who had emigrated in his 20s. He was 60 something when I evaluated him. He had been here in the US for almost 40 years, but still primarily spoke Italian. So he took the MMPI in Italian. And yet, are the US norms really inappropriate for someone who's been here for 40 years? So I might like to plot both and maybe think of them as upper and lower ranges of a confidence interval where the truth is probably somewhere in between. To try to get at the validity data, because again, in forensic assessment, one of the primary purposes that I will use an MMPI for is feigning, or maybe the converse, minimization. One of my now former students, Lily Bopp, did her thesis doing a literature review of translated versions of the MMPI-2 and MMPI-2 RF. She, because it was a more recent study, found 26 studies in 7 languages, most of them Spanish and Italian, only a handful in other languages. And you can see the range of languages, it's a little peculiar. I mean, we've got major countries, China, only 1 study for all of China. Other big countries like India, no studies. A lot of studies that, a lot of languages where we see a lot of immigrants in North America that just aren't represented. And then we've got Norway and Croatia, which are not the most common languages that we need in forensic assessment. And I should note here that Spanish, there are 3 versions of the Spanish MMPI. We collapsed them all because there wasn't any good reason to keep them separate, but they are 3 different versions and they have slight differences. So this table that you can see, the English line shows the range, the confidence interval. These are effect sizes. These are essentially G scores, which are like D scores, but better. And these are the effect sizes for classification accuracy based on these scales. And you can see that the Spanish language scales generally did better. The Spanish language version, I should say, did better than the English language version. So if we're looking at these scales and asking, can I have a reasonable degree of confidence that the F scale or the FP scale accurately captures feigning when it's in the Spanish language version, it seems to do so better than the English version does, by and large, quite a bit better. The Italian versions do a little bit worse. We only have point estimates here, but and again, keep in mind that they do better or they do worse, but they are largely based on these simulation designs, whereas a lot of the English language data is based on known groups designs, which give you much lower effect sizes. So the Spanish and Italian numbers are a little bit inflated. And what that means is our Italian MMPI, the evidence is relatively weak. If you look at the FP scale, that's a pretty low number, 0.82. It's well below the confidence interval for the English language version. So we've got some evidence that these are useful scales, especially in Spanish, which is a common language. There's not enough data from any of the other countries to generate effect sizes. We only have 1 or 2 effects. And so these are at least based on a meta-analysis of a larger sample. First study that I'm aware of that has tried to compare the feigning scales using these translated versions of the MMPI. But at least that gives us some confidence that in Spanish, we probably can use the MMPI with some degree of confidence that it's capturing the same constructs that we think it is in English. What about the other kinds of tests that we use in feigning? Because the other standard type of instrument that we use is the clinician administered test, something like the SIRS. I assume most of you are familiar with it. There's not that many translations. I threw the MFAST in here too, because I want to make a point. There's not that many translations. The SIRS has been used, to my knowledge, and this is again based on reviewing the literature, only in Spanish and Chinese. And it's only publicly available, commercially available in Spanish. We were able to get a Chinese version of it approved by the company because it's out there for research purposes. But there's only a couple of studies, I think only 1 that's been published. Actually, it may not even be published yet. The MFAST has been used in a few other languages. Farsi, that was the study from Iran, Turkish, French, and then a couple of studies in Spanish. So much more limited than the MMPI. And much more challenging. You can't just go out there and buy a copy of the Greek version of the SIRS. The results have been mixed. Generally, the Chinese and the Spanish versions have held up very well. I think all of that research, I'm pretty sure all of those studies, there is one unpublished study of the Chinese version that was based in China, but generally speaking, that's all the SIRS research has been based on US samples. So immigrants to the US who are taking the SIRS in a simulation design generally through, with the translated version. The MFAST has had a lot more variability. So again, we have some confidence in the SIRS with these two languages, only one of which you can purchase if you need to do an evaluation. But if you're in any language other than Spanish, you can't really use the SIRS. The MFAST actually is only available in English, but there have been a couple of studies that have looked at it in other cultures and other languages and have found some problems. This is a study another graduate student of mine, Rebecca Weiss, conducted for her dissertation a few years ago. I won't give any numbers away, but we looked at West African trauma survivors in the US who had come here as refugees. These were all people who had some degree of genuine PTSD symptoms. We had actually three groups. We had people who were genuinely severely symptomatic, people who were had genuinely experienced serious trauma, but didn't have many current PTSD symptoms. And then we had another group that had low PTSD symptoms that we asked to exaggerate their symptoms in a simulation design. And if you look at the data that I'm giving you here, almost 2/3 of those people who had genuine PTSD, quote unquote, failed the MFAST. So if you are using the MFAST using the cut score that is recommended in the test manual, now, granted, it's intended to be a screening tool, but if you use that cut score, 2/3 of the genuinely symptomatic people would fail that test. Now, if you raise the cut score dramatically, you decrease the false positive rate. It's still fairly high. It's still 1 in 6 that are wrongly classified as feigning with a very high cut score, but now you're actually missing half of the people who have been instructed to feign symptoms. And when we examined why that was, we found a lot of items, I shouldn't say a lot, we found several items that seemed really problematic. So this is just an example of one of those. One of the items on the MFAST is I'd feel depressed most of the time. And in our sample of genuinely traumatized or traumatically exposed, people exposed to potentially traumatic experiences, well over half of them of the honest responders endorsed that item. There were a couple of other items that were very, very frequently endorsed. Now, we've got a conflation problem here. We don't know if that's culture, translation, PTSD, a combination of different factors, but it does tell us that this French language, and I guess I didn't put that here, we administered this in French to West African people. Some were in English, but most were in French. We have to have some caution in trying to interpret the MFAST in this sample. And that may, again, reflect it's a much shorter scale than something like the SIRS. So some confidence in the SIRS, not so much confidence in the MFAST, great deal of variability around the MMPI. Where does that leave us with psychiatric symptoms? We've got a lot of variability to think about. We've got a lot of questions, not that many answers, but there's some utility in the research that we have. It also highlights the fact that there is some cultural influences here that seem to impact test accuracy. And again, all that's got to be buttressed by this reminder that a lot of this research, almost all this research, uses simulation designs. Our West African study, we had clinical control groups. Most of these studies have not, including some that I'll talk about next when I talk about cognitive effort testing. So the other half of this analysis is cognitive effort. We've got psychiatric symptoms like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. We've got cognitive symptoms, memory, concentration, intellectual functioning. And of course, the neuropsychologists out there are well aware of the importance of using effort testing when you're doing any kind of a neurocognitive evaluation. It's basically required. How in the world can we interpret test data where effort is so crucial to accuracy? without independently assessing cognitive effort. There are lots of places in our forensic evaluations where this comes into play. Intellectual functioning, right? Having somebody who's got limited intellectual functioning, well, that might negate the death penalty. That might get you a reduced sentence if you're going to accept a guilty plea, or some other form of mitigation. That neurocognitive impairment is very important in civil litigation. So this comes up a lot, and there's a lot of reason to think, even when the classic presentation is psychiatric, things like depression and PTSD, our cognitive effort tests are still useful in those situations, because a lot of people with, for example, PTSD are motivated to exaggerate their memory and concentration problems, because that seems like part of the PTSD picture, and it certainly can be. So if we want to start to think about cognitive functioning in people who are culturally and linguistically diverse or different from our mainstream Western English-speaking culture, we've got lots and lots of challenges. One of these is cognitive effort, but of course, any kind of cognitive or neuropsychological assessment is going to have challenges when we've got somebody whose native language is not English. And I'm not going to get into that whole world. You need the longer workshop for that. I'm going to just stick with effort, and I'm really going to talk primarily about two different measures. But the overarching point that I think we need to keep in mind is that our cognitive effort measures are often nonverbal, and that doesn't mean that they're culture free. I mean, they're appealing when they're nonverbal, aren't they? I can show you pictures. I can ask you to count things. I can show you images and see how many you remember. I don't need to worry about that being mediated by language. That's a lot different than, for example, administering a vocabulary test, where I'm assuming that the translated version of this word into another language has the same level of difficulty as it does in the English language, which is, of course, absurd. So what does that mean if we think about how culture impacts even nonverbal tests? Well, let's start with speed. How many of our nonverbal tests are speed-based? Do this as quickly as you can. Put together these blocks as quickly as you can. There are a lot of cultures, especially non-Western cultures, where speed is not a priority. And the notion that you should rush through a test is really counterintuitive. And if you think about it from a kind of an evolutionary standpoint, there are a lot of scenarios in which, where the expression haste makes waste, well, haste can actually be deadly in certain situations. There are a lot of scenarios where making an error is far more egregious than doing something slowly. So the notion that you should do something quickly and perhaps sacrifice a little bit of accuracy for speed is really foreign to a lot of people. Obviously, some of the images that might be contained in our tests, I mean, those of you who administer the TOM, there are a lot of images there that are very, very Western. I mean, the shopping cart, even a roll of toilet paper. These are unfamiliar in a lot of parts of the world. A birdhouse. Many of these images are laden with Western culture. Even things like matrix reasoning tasks. There's some recent research suggesting that matrix-based testing may be very culturally loaded as well, because this idea of organizing images into rows and columns, very Western. Something I hadn't really understood until a couple of years ago when I started digging into that research a little bit more. So these are the kinds of things we do in nonverbal testing and have long, I think, inherently assumed some degree of accuracy with them. So I'm just going to show you a couple. This is the dot counting test. Some of you may be familiar with it. It's not the most widely used. It's not the most well validated. In some sense, it's the most appealing because, to be honest, I'm hard pressed to think of a culture in which counting doesn't exist. Even if you're a shepherd in somewhere in Uganda, you still got to make sure your entire flock is there. And in point of fact, counting the ungrouped dots might be easier for you if you're a shepherd than counting the grouped dots. But in most Western cultures, counting the grouped dots is easier than the ungrouped. And that's how the test works. Count these as quickly as you can. There are lots of different scoring approaches, but the general idea is speed. How long did it take on average to count these dots and how many mistakes did you make? So again, here's where the speed versus accuracy equation starts to play a role. What do we know about the dot counting test? One of my, again, Becky Weiss, one of my former students, did for her master's thesis, looked at some data from rural India, northwestern. I always have to think of the map in my head to remember where the Punjab region of India is. It's on the Pakistan border. We did an evaluation of 100 plus, not she, but colleagues and I did an evaluation of 100 plus litigants in Punjab who were suing the Indian government. And we found huge failure rates in the dot counting test. Now, that rate could be higher or lower depending on the cut score we applied. But if you were just applying that to a regular cut score for somebody with no obvious or severe mental illness, we got very high rates of false positive. People in Punjab had a very hard time with this test. Now, this is a region of the world, and this is a particular sample within that region where education is not compulsory, where I think we had a third of our sample with no education at all. And not surprisingly, we found a huge correlation, 0.40 between education and performance on the dot counting test. If you look at the US samples, there's no correlation at all. Doesn't matter how educated you are in the US, you can count the dots about as quickly. Now, we didn't find that same correlation in the West African sample, but we did still find a high error rate. And that only went down a little bit when we raised the error rate, not as high. On the other hand, another one of my students, Yi-Ting Chang, she found a very low error rate using Mandarin-speaking immigrants. Now, this was a fairly well-educated sample in the US of Chinese immigrants. So there seem to be some pretty wide variations in how well this test works across different cultures. And there are a couple of other studies out there. There's a bunch of studies from Spain, and they're equally all over the map. And I think this gives you a sense of the high and the low, but it certainly points out this notion that just because it's counting does not make it culture free. In fact, culture might play an even bigger role. We just don't necessarily have that data on a lot of the cultures out there. This is the TOM. Some of you, again, I'm sure are familiar with it. We show images, then we ask, which one did you previously see? And this was one of the best supported studies in the literature review Nidham Jones and I published. We found a pretty high level of sensitivity, a good level of specificity. This was only 7 studies. I believe most of them were from Spain or in Spanish. We found even better results in a recent study of Mandarin-speaking US immigrants. This was the Chang study I just mentioned a minute ago. Perfect specificity, nobody failed the TON, but only about 50% sensitivity. And that's pretty consistent with what you get in the US, but a lot of variability. And the best evidence from that is on this chart. This is a paper that we published in, I think, Law on Human Behavior, but it's on the reference list. If you look at the highlighted columns, you see we only had specificity here. How many cognitively intact, healthy volunteers failed the TOM using the established cut score? In Argentina, 1 person out of 315, almost perfect specificity. In Paraguay, 1/4 of the sample. Look at the next columns. Correlation between age and failure, education and failure. In Paraguay, huge correlations, 0.6. In Argentina, no meaningful correlation. So not only are there different rates of false positives across Latin American countries, but there are different degrees to which factors like age and education relate to that test performance. We also found a very high correlation between the UN Developmental Index, this is at the country level, and country GDP. The more developed the country, the better people did on the TOM. And again, you can see Bolivia, also pretty high error rate, 10% error rate. So what does this tell us? There's meaningful discrepancies even across Spanish-speaking Latin American countries. I'm gonna skip through a little because I've only got a couple minutes left. But there's, I mentioned this at the beginning, there is a little bit of research. Actually, there's quite a bit of research within the US, especially looking at racial and ethnic differences. This has become increasingly important in a lot of contexts that I don't really have time to go into. Generally speaking, we see consistent, statistically significant differences between whites, blacks, Hispanics or Latinx, Indigenous Americans, we see generally in the 5, maybe 7 or 8 T-score point differences on a handful of scales. Most of these are not necessarily clinically significant. A 5 or an 8 or even a 10-point discrepancy on an F scale shouldn't make the difference between identifying somebody as honest versus feigning unless they were already on the fence. And if they were already on the fence, we should probably have some equivocation. But there is certainly some evidence that race and socioeconomic factors impact responses to, for example, the MMPI. Some of this may be a proxy for other factors like intellectual functioning. A lot of this has not been explored. But I make that point because, you know, it's easier in some ways to think about culture across national boundaries than within boundaries. Again, something I don't have a lot of time to go into. So sum it all up, what do we know? There's some support for some of our tests on regarding their validity in detecting feigned symptoms and diminished or insufficient cognitive effort. Most of that research is in Spanish, not so much research in other cultures, other languages. There's important variability even within language, even within what we might think of as a culture. We might think of Latin America as a culture, but maybe that last slide I showed you suggests that it's actually a lot of different cultures that we lump together. And of course, there's other papers that have made that same argument. A lot of that means that we need to be cautious with the cut scores that have been established. We need to be concerned with the risk of false positives. And what does that mean? That means when something is right on the borderline, we should be equivocal. We might not want to have confidence in our interpretation of a 43 on the tom, a 44 on the tom, a 41 on the tom. A 25 on the tom, that's very, very unlikely, even in Paraguay, even with somebody who is older and has no education in Paraguay. I'll close with just a couple of do's and don'ts, I think sort of take-home messages. Don't ignore malingering just because of culture, just because of language. We've got to be cautious in terms of test selection. I've only touched on the tests that are out there and most readily available. We should be even more cautious when we're going outside of Spanish language tests. But, you know, that paper, when we get it out there, it's not yet been accepted. Bop's paper on the MMPI, I think what you'll see is, generally speaking, across all these countries, feigning, the scales for feigning seem to detect feigning reasonably well on the MMPI 2 and RF in the languages it's been translated into. So be cautious in your interpretation. Think about other possible explanations besides feigning. Another don't is don't translate. So do assess malingering, don't ignore it, but don't translate these scales yourself. Don't translate these scales on the fly. If you're Spanish speaking and you don't own a copy, or if you are, let's pick a different example. If you're Mandarin speaking, don't pick up the SIRS and translate it yourself. Don't ask the interpreter to translate it because there's no way of knowing whether that was done properly. We're going to use a proper translation and back translation process in research that you're not going to be able to do in a clinical evaluation. And of course, this is true of all feigning. Don't assume that there's no genuine mental illness simply because you have found evidence that leads you to believe feigning is present. We all know it, but it always needs to be said again. Just because someone is feigning doesn't mean they're not seriously mentally ill too. So I think that's all I have time for, other than some questions. Should I go into the chat or does...
So it's up to you. I'm happy to read them out to you, or if you want to go through them yourself, that's fine too.
Go ahead, you can read them.
All right. So this first one is more of a comment, but it becomes a clinical decision if one is evaluating someone who speaks a language other than English and is from a different country of origin rather recently, which norms to use. Does one use norms from the country of origin or USA norms to compare him to from the USA since he was alleged to have committed the crime in the USA? For example, if I'm looking at submissiveness, which may be relevant to how he would interact with law enforcement, if he's average in submissiveness compared to people in his country of origin, but high on submissiveness compared to people in the USA, I would think the USA norms would be more relevant.
Great question, Bruce. I cheated and I looked to see who's writing our questions. Hi, it's nice to see you on the chat. I'm going to say both. So what I would say is I wouldn't use the norms simply because the person is in that country, because submissiveness isn't really a function of are you submissive relative to the people in the US. We're trying to assess whether this person is unusually submissive. So I want to know both. And I think with something like a test like an MMPI, I don't see any reason why I wouldn't plot it under both sets of norms. I would plot, the Mexican norms if they're from Mexico and the US norms if they're from the US. You do have to, by the way, and I didn't say this earlier, if you want to plot on the Spanish language, on a cultural norm for a Spanish language version, you do have to dig up those norms. There is a textbook that published normative data for the MMPI-2 in samples from Mexico and a couple of other Latin American samples. But if you buy the MMPI-2 in the US, the Spanish language, they're going to just have you plotted on the US norms. And if you score it online, that's what they're going to use. So I almost always these days will plot, if I have culturally specific norms, I almost always plot on those norms so I can see the difference. And that gives me a little bit more of a sense of where they might fall in that spectrum.
All right, the next question is, how might you handle evaluating competency to go to trial for a psychiatric patient who speaks English fairly decently, but you question true comprehension, yet the patient refuses an interpreter largely for cultural reasons? Treatment team members at times take a defensive stance and attribute lack of willingness with feigning or of psychiatric symptoms. The language, for example, is very obscure, like Malaysian, and the interpreter services are a challenge.
Yeah, so this is a tough question because I will always have an interpreter present, even if the person speaks English fairly well, because almost always there'll be some questions that the person struggles with or some concepts that the person struggles with. So I always want an interpreter present. On the other hand, I recognize there are a lot of people from cultures, from countries where there's legitimate concern about whether an interpreter is, let's say, free of government influence. And if you've got someone who you think might have some paranoia, there's legitimate reasons to question whether that's psychotic versus normative. So, what would you do? I mean, I guess the question is, I would first want to have as much of a conversation around the interpretation problem and try to figure out some way to get an interpreter that the person's comfortable with, or maybe some way to have, and this might be a place where, even though I much prefer a face-to-face interpreter, where having a telephonic interpreter would be advantageous because, you could reassure the person that you will not disclose their name or their identity in any way, and that they, or even where you're calling from, and that they can have some degree of confidence in the anonymity of that interpretation process. At the end of the day, if the person refuses to talk to you with an interpreter there, I'm going to have to go with, I mean, in some sense, you're going to have to go with the clinical data that you have and make that determination of whether you think this person is capable of participating meaningfully in the trial. Because, how are they even going to be in a courtroom if there's no interpreter there to help them and there's questions about their comprehension? I wouldn't, and maybe this is where you're going, I wouldn't give them an English comprehension test to see how good their English comprehension is, because that's going to be too narrow. That's going to only give me information about a specific set of questions and concepts that probably have nothing to do with the trial issues. And by and large, in a competency evaluation, there's a handful of very specific questions that I need to know answers to. They're not going to be on that comprehension test. And knowing that they understand completely unrelated concepts doesn't help me if I really want to know, do you understand what a plea bargain is? So I don't know if that's a great answer. I don't, there's not a great solution to that, but I think the telephonic interpretation with, you know, the promise that this will be anonymous might get you some mileage.
Thank you. This next individual says, practically speaking, how would you administer an interview such as the MFAST or SIRS-2 in another language?
Well, so obviously the interpreter has to be the one reading those questions and translating the answers. But I think that's reasonable when the interpretation has been, now I should say, I have an unfair advantage here, which is that I have lots and lots of graduate students at my disposal who speak lots of languages, and I always have a couple of Spanish-speaking graduate students. So when I need a SIRS in Spanish or even an IQ test in Spanish, I just pay one of my graduate students to administer it. And now I have somebody who's trained in the test who can administer it in their own native language. But were I to be, for example, conducting this in another language, and maybe the better example is with an MMPI. If I'm giving someone an MMPI in the language and they come upon a question that they don't understand, they point the question out. Oh, it's question 87. I read it in English. I paraphrase it to the interpreter, and I ask the interpreter to communicate, to translate that paraphrase. And I make notes of, you know, what those items were when that happens. If it were the SIRS and if it were in Chinese, and there were, in fact, I mean, I do in fact have the SIRS in Chinese now. I suppose I could use it with permission from PAR, even though it's not commercially available. I wouldn't be that worried about having an interpreter read a previously, in fact, I'm not worried about having an interpreter read a previously translated item in that language. I'm worried about the interpreter doing the translation, because that requires the interpreter to translate it accurately, and not just at the semantic level, but at the you know, both semantically and also linguistically. So I'm much more comfortable with previously translated and back translated versions of tests with having someone read them aloud, because there's just not that much complexity to it, and then translate back their response. Again, that's the free response portion. I think that's a workable approach. I should note that MFAST is not available in any language. I don't think there's a Spanish language version available commercially. So the only one that you have this option for is the SIRS, where you can, you know, go to PAR's website and buy a pack of 25 Spanish language SIRS, and like me, you'll have 22 of them sitting in your test drawers for the next 3 years.
For those of you that need to jump off, it is 1 o'clock. We are going to stay on a little bit longer to address more of your questions, but in terms of official end time, we're there. Okay, so the next question is, in the case of the Chinese individual, shouldn't the MMPI-2 have been administered in Chinese rather than English? In this person's experience, there are often times when a staff at a hospital or jail will insist that someone speaks English just fine because the defendant can converse about their daily needs, but there are still subtleties in our use and understanding of American language. Someone who did not grow up in our culture would have a lot of difficulty understanding. The bottom line is, someone's apparent proficiency in English does not mean that taking a test in English or being evaluated in English is appropriate.
So you're absolutely right. I didn't give you all the details in this particular case. This happened to be a physician who was practicing and went to medical school in the U.S. So he'd been in the U.S. for, well, let me think. He did his residency in the U.S. So his English was actually quite good. There were some acculturation questions. Normally, absolutely. I will always default for the language of the person's comfort. And the only time that I've ever deviated from that is when I just couldn't get a copy of the MMPI in that language. And often I won't use the MMPI at all if I can't get a copy in that language. If the person is from a language in which there is an MMPI available, I might use both norms, and I might ask them, which one would you prefer? With Spanish, where I've got, excuse me for a second. Excuse me. In Spanish, where I've got in my test drawer both the Spanish and the English version, I'll sometimes give them both. And I'll say, you know, you use whichever one you're comfortable with. And if there's an item you're not sure of, read it in English, read it in Spanish. If you still want clarity, we'll paraphrase it. I'll usually let the person I'm evaluating tell me which one they're most comfortable with. But you know, if I've already gone ahead and bought the Croatian version, I probably want to use it because I just spent $400 on it. It's hard to get the Croatian one too, by the way.
Has there been any research presented where the authors suggest or demonstrate that individuals from certain cultural groups are more likely to engage in feigning?
Short answer is no. There are actually there's some research that some cultures are less likely to engage in feigning. And if you think about that, you know, I mean, think about civil settings in this country, the potential compensation for, you know, in civil litigation here is astronomical. In many countries, it's non-existent. So the whole notion of feigning in some cultures is you know, foreign to some people. The one thing I would say that sort of fits with this question is that one of the things that we've seen colleagues and I who do asylum and refugee immigration evaluations, there are some cultures where people will talk about the experiences of the group in a way that makes it sound like it was their experience. They will use the kind of the we, I, they almost interchangeably. And my impression of that, and this has not been systematically studied or validated, but my impression of that is that that's a cultural phenomenon where the events that affect the group are sort of shared events. Even though it didn't happen to this person, they will talk about, you know, torture or murder that happened to someone else they know. And it sounds like they're talking about themselves. I don't think that's feigning. I think that's a cultural way of speaking that will sometimes make us lead us to believe that the person is saying things that didn't exist. And if you follow up with specific questions, that'll sometimes become clear. Meaning, you know, so did that happen to you or someone you know? And that clarification can often make it clear that they're not trying to present it as themselves. They just spoke in a way that was communicated that way.
Sort of along the same lines, is there research that talks about African American groups and malingering instruments?
I mean, there's a number of studies that just ask the question, are there racial differences within the sample? And generally there are not. The only place where that's systematic and it's not really malingering studies, is the MMPI, where you do see, you know, 6, 7, 8 point differences mean differences on the F scale, for example. Most of that research is older, so I don't know of any that looks at FP, which is of course the better malingering detection scale. But you know, research with the TOM and most of these other instruments don't show that. We don't really have any evidence that there's an elevated risk of false classification just based on race within the US. There are certainly notable racial differences on tests on other kinds of testing, but not with the kind of more extreme, not that I've seen.
What are your thoughts about the effect of age on something like the TOM where the stimuli haven't been updated recently?
You know, that's a good question. I mean, I think that the TOM at some point, you know, these tests may have a lifespan. It isn't intended to tap any kind of learned ability. So it's hard for me to imagine a good cognitive explanation as to why you would need to update norms or update that test. On the other hand, I think if, you know, the author was making that test today, he might have chosen some different stimuli that are a little bit less culturally loaded. I think in the early 1990s, we just weren't thinking about some of these questions, you know, and maybe you don't want a spinning wheel, or nobody knows, or the Jack in the Box, some of these sort of oddball stimuli. But I can't think of a good reason why it would need to be updated. And of course, it's always an issue. I mean, I think the bigger question is that as these tests become better known, there's a greater likelihood that people who we evaluate will have heard of them. And so, fortunately, the cover of my Tom fell off because of age. So it doesn't say Tom anymore when I hand it to the person. But that's always a worry for me, is that someone's done a little bit of research. If they've just Googled my website, I had an evaluee start asking me questions before we started the evaluation about some of my research. It was clear she'd read some of my malingering papers. So I'm fairly suspicious that she knows what these tests are used for. And I try really hard now to avoid putting cut scores in the test, in the publications. But every now and then they have snuck in, and certainly other people do. So that's really the bigger challenge, I think, is just, the widespread availability of knowledge of these tests.
Speaking of your website, does it include references to your publications or books?
It's got my CV. It's a couple years out of date, apparently, because someone asked me about it the other day. So I really should put an updated one out there, and I will now that I'm thinking about it, or I'll ask somebody to put it up there. But yes, there should be. And I think if I haven't looked at the slides, but I think that there was, so the slides do have most of the papers that I have talked about today, at least all the ones of mine that I talked about today.
This individual would like, go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. How are you able to obtain test data from so many countries?
I've done a fair amount of international consulting, and I've got a lot of graduate students that have done a lot of research. I mean, one of my students moved to Mexico City, Nidam Jones, who's published several of these papers that I've quoted. She moved to Mexico City to live for a year and do her dissertation, and collected data in a Mexico City prison. So, I've had the fortune of, because I've been working in this area, a lot of students come with this specific goal. And so they've really been the vehicle for most of this. A lot of this, though, has been, I live in New York. We've got every language spoken here. We've got any cultural group you can think of, we can find a sample for it.
All right. The next person would like to know, in regards to the table that you presented with Tom's specificity rates in different countries, were those numbers calculated based upon below chance threshold, so less than 18?
No.
Okay.
No, those are all based on the established cut score. Yep. So nobody, that was a normative sample. Nobody in that sample scored below chance. But of course, in practice, we hardly ever get below chance Tom scores. I've gotten them a few times, but I could probably count them on less than 2 hands. And, most of the time we're looking at scores in the mid, high 20s, 30s, maybe even 40, 41. And so I do think degree of the magnitude of failure is important. I'm much more confident as it goes below a certain threshold. But you don't see a lot of people with genuine mental disorder scoring below, let's say, a 30 on the Tom. In fact, it's almost unheard of, a 35 even. Very, very rare. And that was true in those samples too. There was no one who scored below chance. I don't even think anyone scored in the chance range.
Can you speak to accurately explaining cultural adjustments and considerations of test data interpretation during testimony, particularly if your level of expertise about that culture is challenged by an attorney?
In 5 minutes or less? Probably not. First of all, I'm always transparent, or as transparent as I can realistically be, about my level of expertise. If there's cultural issues, I'll sometimes use a consultant. I'll sometimes reach out to a cultural consultant to get some information about certain topics, and I'll take notes and I'll disclose that in the course of my report, and I'll disclose the notes I took. I will disclose what I've done to account for that interpretation, my interpretation. So, the question that was raised earlier about using one set of norms versus another set of norms, and why I might use both, and why I might then look at the interpretation, and why I would make a given interpretation based on these two sets of norms. I'm always pretty cautious, I hope, in my interpretation. So, and certainly when we're talking about feigning, when we're talking about malingering, I think there's nothing more important than erring on the side of caution, because the ramifications of calling someone a feigner or a malingerer when they're not are devastating. If it's a disability evaluation or a civil litigation and you've cut off their only source of financial support for the rest of their life and they really are genuinely impaired, you've destroyed their life. If they're a criminal defendant and you're sending them to court completely incompetent and psychotic because you thought that they were feigning, you've destroyed their life. If you've missed it and you've erred on the side of, I don't have good reason to say that they are feigning, so I'm going to err on the side of caution, I'm confident that the system can resolve it. If somebody goes to trial and they really were, goes to the hospital because I thought they were probably incompetent, they've got time to assess that person in the hospital. If it's a Vinny the Chin Gigante situation and 3 years later they come back and say, hey, doc, you missed it, this guy was clearly faking, I'm okay with that. If the insurance company wants to put a private investigator on them and 3 years later saying, hey, it looks like that was fraud, let them go after the person. So I'm much more comfortable with the failure to detect malingering than I am overly ambitious. I don't get any extra money for identifying malingering. There's no bonus prize. I think some people get a little bit of ego investment. They don't want to be fooled. And, frankly, my feeling is if you can fool me, good for you. We've all been doing this for a long time. You got to do a pretty good job to fool a good forensic psychologist or psychiatrist.
Other than the use of the TOM or similar instruments, can you suggest other ways to assess malingering on the Mexican WAIS? For example, variation in scores across subtests.
I don't think there's much evidence that variations in scores across subtests is useful on the WAIS. There are things like reliable digit span, and I can't think of a good reason why that wouldn't be equally valid in foreign language. And by the way, there are translations of the WAIS in a whole bunch of languages. It took me a long time to find that website, but there are translations in lots and lots of languages. Some of those languages that, something like reliable digit span might not be as useful. There aren't a whole lot reliable digit span is really the only well-established effort indicator on the WAIS in my assessment. There are some other, on the WIMS, there are some tests that have a little bit more utility in that way. But unless I've missed some literature on the WAIS, most of the kind of pattern interpretation of the WAIS doesn't really support it for assessing feigning. I think we run a big risk of confusing selective impairment with deliberate cognitive effort. I would be inclined, if I'm giving a WAIS, I'm probably going to give a TOM. I'm probably going to give something like a dot tuning test, and I'll interpret them judiciously, meaning I'm not looking for did you just miss the cut score. I'm looking for how far did you miss the cut score by, to convey to me how much confidence can I have that you didn't try your hardest. And the farther away you get from that cut score, the more confident I am.
Can you talk about how to access the Spanish version norm resources that you mentioned?
Yeah, well, so there's a book by Butcher on the MMPI 2, and in the back of that, he published, it's an old book at this point. It's like 25 years old. But it's got Mexican norms. It's got a couple of other countries. There's an appendix with norm tables. And so you can actually see means and standard deviations. And unless I'm misremembering, you can convert directly to T-scores because they're not all linear T-scores, right, on the MMPI. Some are uniform, some are linear. So there are tables, I believe, that will convert to T-scores for some translations. That I haven't looked to see whether all of the versions of the MMPI. I only have the one Spanish language version that's sold by Pearson. I don't know whether the other Spanish language versions come with their own sets of norms, because I haven't had a good reason to buy multiple versions because I haven't seen good evidence that there's much real variation between them. So, but any of the versions, the translated versions that you buy will typically have a manual that comes with it. Now, the manual is usually going to be written in that foreign language. So you get the Italian manual, it's written in Italian. You get the Greek manual. The Greek norms actually have been published in English, but it's going to be written literally in Greek. And you can't even, work on that phonetically and read it out loud to Google Translate. So you might have to, a lot of these become fairly challenging, whether there's resources available to purchase this test, to get somebody to translate portions of the manual. Again, with the benefit of a university at my disposal and a good friend who runs a translation service at another university, I've been fortunate to get a lot of things translated for free or cheap. But often it's very hard. And same thing with translating a test. If there's, for example, a SKID and you want to like a SKID subtest or the CAPS, sometimes I'll have that translated and back translated into another language, generally for research purposes, but there's no reason why you couldn't do it for clinical purposes. They're just symptom interviews, diagnostic interviews. I wouldn't do that with an MFAST. I wouldn't do that with a SIRS, because I just don't have any confidence that those questions are going to have the same meaning.
All right, somebody posted an article you might be interested in. It's in the Q&A. Elle said, FY, there is a Spanish MFAST available.
I see that. Thank you, Nicole. I did not know that. I don't use the MFAST a lot, but that's good to know.
Yep. Another individual found your dot counting issue fascinating. And I think we're done with questions for today. So thank you so much for being here and talking with us. This was fantastic.
It was my pleasure. It's nice to see you all, and thanks everybody for coming. I hope this was worth the hour. All right. Take care.
Thank you so much, Barry.
My pleasure. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And I just wanted to remind folks that the link to the evaluation is in the chat. If you don't have access to the chat, you can send us an email and we will email you the link. And otherwise, we'll see everybody next week. Thanks, Anne.
Rachel.
Have a good one.